This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello, I'm Philip Dodd and welcome to the Arts and Ideas discussion programme from BBC Radio 3, which brings together leading artists, writers and thinkers. If you enjoy what you hear, do subscribe to the Arts and Ideas podcast, and wherever you get your podcasts from, do rate and review us. It'll help other people to find us.
This is the BBC.
A loose network of thinkers and media people forced to become heretics and who claim they're simply free thinkers. This is one account of those who are said to belong to the intellectual dark web, a term half-jokingly conjured up by one of its members. They are the subject of this edition of Free Thinking. Free speech, identity politics and religion, especially Islam, are for many of them key issues, and their argument is that educational and mainstream media are in thrall to a politically correct elite and social justice warriors who wish to regulate what can be said and who can say it. Some may say that the intellectual dark web is simply North American, but actually it has threads here, one of whom is in the studio, Douglas Murray, journalist and author of The Strange Death of Europe, which speaks of Europe's cultural suicide. My second guest is Bari Weiss, a New York Times columnist with some sympathy for the ideas of the intellectual dark web, who wrote a long opinion piece on the network. She's down the line from New York. And last but not least is Ed Hussein, co-founder of the Quilliam Foundation and author of The House of Islam, A Global History. Although he knows about the intellectual dark web, he's not a member. Bari, I wonder if I can begin with you. You speak of this group of the intellectual dark web as thinking of themselves or being pushed into being heretics. I want to ask you, to be a heretic, there has to be a church. Do you think in the States there is a kind of orthodoxy around that these people are, or at least believe they are, pushing against?
I think increasingly, yes. I wouldn't say that that's true in the country at large, but I would say that absolutely it's true in sort of culturally elite institutions, places like, frankly, the building that I'm sitting in right now.
Which is the New York Times, presumably.
Which is the New York Times, but certainly universities, which, a lot of these people are coming from academic backgrounds. A generation prior, you could easily see them having thriving careers at extremely prestigious institutions, and many of them, having huge success, but very much outside the mainstream. Some of them having been explicitly purged, for example, like Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying from Evergreen University.
And this was in effect for resisting an injunction that they should depart from the university to allow the African-American black students to take it over for a day.
Well, it's actually a very good example because the two of them, without getting too much into the weeds, are sort of lifelong progressives. Both of them, I would say, probably identify economically sort of as socialists. Both were supporters of Bernie Sanders. Both were hugely involved in the Occupy Wall Street protests, to give you a sense of who they are. They both taught for over a decade at an extremely progressive school here out west called Evergreen. Your listeners may not have heard of it, but it's sort of famous for its progressive politics. And so that's sort of their background. That's how they were very much steeped in that world. And sort of for the slightest departure from woke orthodoxy, I would call it. I don't know if you guys have the word woke.
No, you should
England,
explain these strange American terms.
Okay. So I would say woke is sort of radical left progressivism, and a very much sort of a doctrinaire approach or an orthodox approach to identity politics specifically, and for raising a concern about what was in effect a day of racial segregation, asking white students to leave campus just for voicing a sort of skepticism about that. They were not only smeared, but they were physically threatened. They had to leave their home and go out to LA for a week or so. The police force told them they were under threat. I mean, this is really an exceptional state of affairs, and they are far from the only people that have experienced things like this.
Okay, let me bring us to Britain and to London and to you, Douglas. And you are, at least you've been so categorised as one of the network of the intellectual dark web. Do you think the politics of Europe are different from America? If, in other words, if there is an Orthodox church here, are its parameters different from what Bari has just described?
No, I think they're broadly similar. Of course, the politics are very different in every country. They're different in every European country. But I think that orthodoxy that Bari Weiss talks about and which she wrote about in her piece in the New York Times is very familiar to people here. And there are lots of reasons for that. One, you could point out an obvious one is the age of social media and the age of the internet, where somebody in a state in America that a lot of people won't have heard of, or a college in America a lot of people won't have heard of, suddenly can kind of get in on the act, either of praising an act of bravery on behalf of a person, or indeed of condemning them, of accusing them of some kind of thought crime. And this social media age has really whipped this along, I think. It's an absolutely crucial part in it, which means all of these things together, I would say, an already existing orthodoxy enforced by mobs online, I think has made thinking aloud almost impossible.
Although we're here thinking aloud, so almost impossible may be an inflation.
Well, we haven't done it yet. We haven't done it yet, and we are in the BBC, and it's not the case that everywhere.
We haven't done it yet.
Sorry, Bari.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I'm extremely cautious in terms of, for example, the podcasts that I'll say yes to, the TV shows that I'll agree to. And a lot of that is because I know that it's all going to be recorded and, thrown out into the echo chamber of Twitter endlessly, and that my words will be twisted or that a clause will be ripped out of context and that I'll be made to pay for that. Yeah. And that's a real concern.
This is something which it comes back to. We may be sitting in one of the hearts of the liberal orthodoxy here in London and the BBC, in which there is definitely a form of orthodoxy, albeit it can be broken at times. But here's the problem. It's not just that thinking aloud and trying things out has become risky. It's become potentially career-ending for a lot of people. And here's the additional problem. Most of us who write and think are used to the idea that you write and you think and you speak, broadly speaking, in order that a person can't legitimately make honest claims against you. And now we enter this new stage in the age of the internet, where you have to write and speak and think in order that a dishonest person cannot dishonestly misrepresent you. And so many people, I think, of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all political types, have become increasingly worried about this. That's one of the reasons why, if I may point out finally, that the people identified in this very loose network of people are of such a wide array of political, ethnic, religious and other standpoints. They're simply people who at some point have tripped over this wire and then have got somehow to the other end of it. OK,
so just two things before we develop it. The first is, if you cannot speak... We're speaking to somebody from the New York Times and an associate editor of The Spectator. So these are heretics in the establishment themselves. That is you, Douglas, and you, Bari. And the second thing is heretics historically have been willing to die for their faith. That's what happened with the Protestants who got burnt by the Catholics, and then the Catholics who got burnt by the Protestants. So risk here is a different matter from what historically heretics have dealt with.
Of course, we're not talking about a life and death situation, but we're certainly talking about tremendous reputational damage potentially. But as I also get into, and career ending, as Douglas pointed out, but as I point out readily in the piece that I wrote, there's also an enormous upside to this, which is that once you sort of cross the line and you take the heat for whatever your perceived or real thought crime is, then you're on the other side of it. And the other side of it increasingly, and this is what has sort of been fascinating to me, you can find an audience that's arguably much bigger than the audience you can get from publishing an op-ed, let's say, in a place like the New York Times.
And if I may just quickly chip in on that again, because of the nature of the loose association of people we're talking about, inevitably some people might be regarded as insiders in your view, and some might be regarded as outsiders. Some may have lost their job, like the Weinsteins, for breaking a part of a very recent orthodoxy. Others may be at risk of losing their jobs. I happen to be fortunate that I have people who are willing to publish me. But that doesn't mean that it's all easy. And I think in a number of cases of people of this loose association we're talking about, actually an element of risk has been rather clear in a number of cases. So I wouldn't entirely downplay that. Remember, this is an era where somebody like Nobel Prize-winning scientist like Tim Hunt can make an off-colour joke in another continent. By the time his plane's landed, his entire career has been ripped apart from him. Okay. And that is the background to all of this.
All right. Well, listen, I want to come back to the universities later. What I'd like to do now is pick up, in a sense, what's been implicit, thought crimes. It's too Orwellian for me. But, I mean, the whole issue of free speech, and we've also got, sat here as I introduced at the beginning, Ed Hussein, and I want to now bring him into the conversation. You're not an absolutist, are you, Douglas, in terms of free speech? You think there are some limits. It's when, not if.
The only limit I can think of is when you're inciting people to kill people, and that's pretty clear, and that's pretty much agreed in most countries, I think.
So you would give support, for instance, to the black American footballers kneeling, and they ought to have the right to be able to do that without being punished.
Sure, of course.
Tell us, Barry, if you would, where you think the free speech war is in America now.
That's a very broad question. Do you mean in terms of the NFL?
Well, let me give you an example.
Sure.
Matthew Arnold says, freedom is a really good horse, but you have to ride it somewhere. In other words, what is the point of defending free speech? Is it an absolute right? Where do those who are defending free speech in that way, where do they want to ride the horse?
To me, free speech is such a foundational value. Everything comes from it. I mean, free speech is about defending the right, as we were talking about before, to sort of thinking freely. And that's why I've been an outspoken supporter of the right of players in the NFL to protest. But that said, when Roseanne Barr, who had the most highly rated sitcom year, tweets something that was just out and out racist, of course it's her network's prerogative to fire her if they want. I don't see that as a threat to free speech in the way that some on the right did.
Well, I just this thing of where you want to write it to. Here it seems to me is the problem. In the orthodoxy, whether we agree it exists or what its parameters are or not, something strange has happened, whereby a meaningful discussion on almost any really important thing almost cannot happen in public anymore. Let me give you an example. You've trodden upon it recently in your interview with Jordan Peterson, issues of differences between the genders. Let me give you another example, transgender. I saw the other day a BBC interviewer interviewing Jordan, and she says, are you saying that somebody born a man who then becomes a woman is not a real woman? And when he says, yes, I don't think that's a real woman, you can see he's answered it the wrong way for the time being.
Well, we have the passage from Jordan Peterson where he's speaking about masculinity and femininity, and he responds to my question, which is a question why most of his readers are male.
More my viewers than my readers, and part of that is because 80% of people who watch YouTube happen to be men. So it's hard to segregate that general statistic from the specific statistics of my channel. Well, it isn't really that I'm concerned with men. I'm concerned with what's symbolically masculine. And that actually is different. I think that because we have this proclivity to view our current social structure through the lens of patriarchal tyranny, that we confuse attempts by people to take their proper place in that hierarchy as a consequence of the manifestation of their competence with the manifestation of power and tyranny, and that's tremendously demoralizing, especially to young men. Now, it doesn't seem to affect young women as much, and I think the reason for that... Why doesn't it?
No, why is it debilitating to men?
Well, because if you tell men who are trying to do their best in the world that all they're doing is manifesting the kind of behavior that led to a tyrannical patriarchy, you're not exactly encouraging them to do their best in the world.
So that was Jordan Peterson. He speaks, in fact, avoiding Jordan Peterson at the moment is really difficult.
Sure.
So I just think you're inflecting.
Why is that?
Sorry, Douglas.
Yes,
okay.
Why is that?
No,
it's because he's just about the only person willing to do that in public. Do you think that other people don't recognise there are differences in the genders? Of course they do. It's just they're not willing to put their necks on the line by saying it. Do you think that most people actually think that somebody born a man who transitions into a woman is exactly the same thing as somebody born a woman? Of course not. How many people who are trying to hold down down a job in, for instance, a publicly funded institution are willing to go there. What I'm saying is this is indicative of something broader, which is that there is this fear that that new lines are being drawn, they're being drawn very deep, and very many people feel that they will just go plummeting over if they go into it. So that's why you've got a Jordan Peterson obsession at the moment.
Jordan
Peterson.
Barry, let me just say, Channel 4 has just devoted a whole week to this issue. So I'm not sure, Douglas, that you're right.
To which issue?
To the issue of gender fluidity, of a whole range of things. But and of course, Jermaine Greer was on it. But Barry, you were in America.
All I was going to say, one thing about Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson's fame is perhaps the most salient symbol of our current political moment. Jordan Peterson is standing up there and saying some of the most basic home truths that conservatives have been saying for decades, and he is being lapped up by young people desperate to hear something like that. The proper response to Jordan Peterson is to say, why is this happening? And the reason it is happening is because he is one of the only people out there filling this gaping chasm, because no one else is willing to say this stuff. And the fact that people in our world, in the media world, are sort of failing to see what the phenomenon of him really means is mind-blowing to me.
Ed?
I've been following Professor Peterson's work now for about 3 years, and Barry's absolutely right that he's a phenomenon online. But let's not forget the reason why he's shot to prominence is because of that Channel 4 interview, i.e. a mainstream stroke-on-stroke liberal platform that gave him an interview. And on that interview, he had to quote this gotcha moment. And
he got 6 million viewers.
Moment.
No. Prior to that, his book wasn't selling as well as it did after the Channel 4 news interview. Now, there have been other pariahs and heretics here who haven't been included in the intellectual dark web, and I'd put Sir Roger Scruton there. And he's been battling and making very similar arguments now for more than a decade. And people also, Jermaine Greer comes to mind. The thing, just listening to Douglas and Barry comes to my mind, Philip, is that many of these individuals that we're highlighting, I mean, I came across Douglas on BBC Question Time about 8 years ago. Neil Ferguson writes a column for the Sunday Times. He's a professor at Harvard. Sam Harris is a regular contributor to Fox News. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she was at the American Enterprise Institute and then subsequently at Harvard. So, I take issue with the fact that there's somehow been picked up from the internet where they've only had a voice and previously they didn't have a voice.
But how do you feel about the point that Douglas and Barry are making, that certain things are almost unsayable?
On the race question, yes. On the Islam question, yes. And
well, we will come to that. On others?
On the race question, yes. And also, I think on homosexuality, certainly Douglas is right on transsexuality, if that's the correct expression. And this is where political correctness has gone wild. My biggest concern in all this is it just shuts down debate. It stops people from saying what they should be able to say, then be challenged on it, and let the strongest argument win. I think Barry's absolutely right on identifying what you call thought crime. But to think that people can't express themselves publicly, I think people can, but the problem is the hit back has been too hard. I think it was last year when the students who wanted to remove the statue of Cecil Rhodes at SOAS, students refusing to study white men because they were Socrates, Plato and Aristotle were white men. And that kind of mass ignorance that's playing out, I think Barry had it right. It's primarily on campuses, and it's not something that's predominant in the mainstream media.
Douglas?
No, I think it's on campus, but it's leaking out into certainly Silicon Valley, absolutely the press. Let me just give you one example. I had a dinner last week. It happened to be a bunch of young men, but younger than me. They're all in different fields, some in law, some journalists. All of them identify as liberal. But they get together once a month to have what they call a thought criminal dinner because every single day in their work, they closet themselves about their real views. And by the way, none of these people are Trump supporters. Not all of these people voted for Hillary. When I say their real views, I mean anything at all that doesn't go along with this view of sort of America as a terrible, as the worst place on earth, the idea that we don't necessarily live in a system of oppressive patriarchy, things like that. I mean, they basically feel like they're sort of intellectually closeted. That's an amazing state of affairs.
Let me just, of course, one response to that is, God, are they cowards? You know, why should they belong to institutions where they don't stand up?
But look, give an example. I mean, in Silicon Valley, James Damore was asked to write a memo looking into why women didn't perform certain roles in Silicon Valley. He wrote the memo and lost his life.
He lost his
livelihood.
He was a Google man.
He lost his livelihood over it. He wrote a memo, but he came back with the wrong answer. You know, you think that other people in Silicon Valley don't take a lesson from that? Why would you say why there is a preponderance of men in certain roles in Silicon Valley if you knew there was only one answer?
I'm sorry to sound like a 16th, 17th century Protestant, because heretics have to take the consequences of their actions.
Sure, absolutely.
No, but I'm sorry. Wait, no, Philip, I just want to object to that. You keep coming back to this idea that they're heretics. What I'm telling you is they're not heretics.
Yes.
They're people with incredibly normative views that are being called heretics for having those normal views. And the idea that it's like you think that they have some kind of heroic self-perception of themselves. They don't. They're normal people.
No, I don't think they have a heroic. What I'm saying is if you believe something, if I believe something, I don't bite my tongue in the BBC, not because I'm heroic, but just because I have certain beliefs.
Sure, but you're also very lucky that you have a platform and you have a wide parameter to operate within it. I'm very lucky because I have platforms and I have understanding editors. But not everybody is in that situation. And
Let's say you're a 25-year-old coder. Sorry.
Yes, exactly. A 25-year-old coder in Silicon Valley who knows that if you come up with the wrong answer, you're out of a job. Now, you and I might say, go and do something else. And a perfectly good answer that might be for some people. But it comes back to this point. Look, if you look at the people who have tripped on a wire in recent years, Ed mentioned one of them, Germaine Greer. You know, Germaine Greer becomes at one point in recent years sort of uninvitable. And again, if people think that Germaine Greer's out of the mainstream, and you think that anyone who meant what used to be a sort of first or second wave feminist is out of the mainstream, we've had it recently in the UK, sorry to get all parochial, with the Labour Party, where if you're a woman in the Labour Party who believes that an all-women shortlist should be people who are actually all women, then you're now a bigot. So what do we do with this? Is it the case that all of these Labour women have all decided actually gender is just what you choose? Or is it possible everyone's just going to shut up? Now, my view is that most people are just going to shut up and try to ride this one out. But it does mean that there are some people, and I hope there are more, who will say, no, for various reasons, career-wise or otherwise, I'm in a position to say what I think, and I'll use that prerogative.
Barry, you mentioned that it started in the campuses and is leaking out. In a sense, it's a struggle within elites, this, isn't it? Because it doesn't largely preoccupy or affect people who live outside Silicon Valley and the media and the universities. Or do you think it's getting wider than that?
I think the reason that it does is that, you know, I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm from a family, very, very mixed political family. And when I go home and I talk to my family or, you know, to my brother-in-law who's a firefighter, and they see that I'm being called a bigot and a racist, and they know me to be someone on the center left, they sort of look at themselves and say, these people have lost their minds. And I think that that has incredibly broad political implications for the country.
Yeah. It's something also that almost everybody in this very loosely defined network has experienced at some point. Sam Harris, you mentioned, a neuroscientist and atheist, just, I think, had the shock of his life when he realised what was coming for him when he tripped over certain wires that are laid down now. Sam Harris,
these were wires around Islam.
Mainly for him around Islam. In his case, it was that actor...
Ben Affleck.
Ben Affleck.
I'm sorry.
Ben Affleck,
on Bill Maher.
On Bill Maher. Basically accuses Sam Harris of being a racist. Sam Harris is like, he's a Democrat, leftist, West Coast yoga guy, and they say he's a Nazi.
Okay, then let's listen to it.
Sure.
Because we have this wonderful capacity in the BBC for you to conjure something up and we deliver it immediately.
I'm in awe.
We have been sold this meme of Islamophobia where every criticism of the doctrine of Islam gets conflated with bigotry toward Muslims as people.
Right.
And that is it's intellectually ridiculous. Even it gets
so hold on, are
racist.
you the person who understands the officially codified doctrine of Islam? You're the interpreter of that, so you can say, well, this is...
I'm actually well educated on this topic.
I'm asking you. So you're saying if I criticize you're saying that Islamophobia is not a real thing. That if you're critical of something...
Well, it's not a real thing when we do it.
Right.
It really isn't.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people. And that's a problem.
Big of you.
But
why are you so hostile about this?
It's gross. It's racist.
It's not. But it's so nuts.
It's like saying those stateless, shifty Jew.
You're not listening
Absolutely
to
not.
what we are saying.
You guys are saying if you want to be liberals, believe in liberal principles like freedom of speech, like we are endowed by our forefathers with inalienable rights, like all men are created equal.
Ben, we have to be able to criticize bad ideas. And
of course we do. No liberal doesn't want to criticize bad ideas.
But Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas.
Jesus.
So we have
That's
ideas
just a fact.
like blasphemy.
It is
an ugly thing.
Apostasy.
It is
basic liberal
Well, let me
principles.
unpack it.
That was Sam Harris and the actor Ben Affleck on Bill Mayer's Real Time from 2014. Ed, how do you respond to this? I mean, because you yourself, in a different way, although not at all associated with the intellectual dark web, have had issues with how Islam can be talked about.
The big issue here is that I think for Ben Affleck, there's an inherent decency that he found talking negatively about Islam to be offensive to him. And I get that, and I understand that. I think most people are in that space, that you don't speak ill of someone's religion or someone's kind of family background. I mean, it's just a dinner table test and decency and common human civility. I think that's what he was trying to object to. Now, for Sam Harris, he's an intellectual and he's making a valid point, and the point is that we should be fully within our rights to criticise Islam, Muslim history, theology, scripture. But I think my objection is to the way in which it's done. So the reference to the motherlode of bad ideas, I mean, that's provocative. Now, those who wish to be provocative, it's fully within the right to be so. The issue then becomes is when you try to shut it down and say it's not acceptable. So Christopher Hitchens for many years was in many ways a pioneer of this kind of avant-garde thought process. He wrote a book called God is Not Great, a direct rebuke to the daily Muslim prayer of God is great. So, I mean, he thrived, he made those points, and in many ways, those who wished to respond to him did, and those who didn't wish to respond to him didn't. But you wouldn't call him racist for that. And I think to call Sam Harris racist is going too far.
Part of the issue, isn't it? Forgive me, Barry, is that we don't have a language to speak about religion. Because the truth is, from Brazil to China, Pentecostalism is running riot. Christianity is on the rise. There are twice as many Christians who are migrants to Britain as there are Muslims. We don't, the secular liberal lot, if I might describe them like that, just doesn't have an idiom in which to speak about it.
Well, that may well be true.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
It means that
the
logic of thinking that secular liberalism is the end goal of history is contradicted by all kinds of beliefs in Christianity and Islam, which the secular narrative can't address because it doesn't understand them, because it thinks they were left in prehistory. And what I'm saying is it looks as if religion is coming way back into the public sphere. I said there are now more Protestants soon in Brazil than there will be Catholics. China will have 250 million Christians by 2050. There are twice as many Christian migrants into Britain as there are Muslim migrants.
Well, that may be true. Certainly, secular liberal societies find it quite hard to find a new language in which to respond to it, and I think find it rather hard to understand religion on its own terms. Part of, I suppose, what has been going on recently, and to get back to the subject we started on, is that there is a form of religion that has seeped up in our own societies, and it has its own doctrines. And I'm just very struck by the fact that those doctrines have been slipped into very easily.
Give us some examples.
The swimmer Tom Daly and his husband Dustin Lance Black announce on Twitter they have a photo of them both holding a sonogram of a fetus with a kind of "we're pregnant." Everyone was sort of only yay, and then somebody in the Mail, I think, wrote a thing saying, "Well, are we sure about this?" Huge backlash. I ended up writing a piece. Look, as a gay man myself, as it happens, it's not homophobic to say, hang on, look, just like let's just roll back a bit. How does this happen? And are we absolutely great with? Are we fine with it? Why haven't we had the discussion about any of this? Now, it goes back to the point I tried to make at the beginning. To have a discussion about it is very risky, because we've sort of landed on something. I'm not saying that good luck to them. I hope they're happy. But it's just that we haven't really had any of that discussion. And the line's been drawn, and everyone's just told, get with it. And a lot of people just, it's not that they hate people, it's not that they're bigots, it's not that they're homophobes. It's just that they wish we could have some of this out a bit. I'm saying on a whole set of issues to do with birth, life, love, death, religion, and the meaning of most things, it has become perilous to think about them. That's why you have somebody like Christine Hoff Sommers, regarded as being part of this intellectual dark web, who's just...
She's a feminist.
A first-wave feminist who just wants us to think through some of this stuff a bit more. And for that, she goes to universities, she gets assaulted, and so on and so forth. Why aren't we even able to think about that? That, by the way, is why the university bit of this is important. If you, at an Ivy League university or at Oxford and Cambridge, aren't allowed to think aloud about birth, life, love, death, fate, religion, then who do you want to do the thinking on this?
Barry?
Two things. One, the reason that I think that it's so important that we have conversations about the exact sort of fundamental issues that Douglas is talking about is because do we want all the talk, real people thinking about those issues, to be happening in the sort of on the fringe, in alt-right forums online? I certainly don't. I want them to be talked about in sane ways in the mainstream.
I lived in New York for about 3-4 years, and I completely agree with what Barry's saying. But I think that the real elephant in the room is questions around Islam and Muslims. Whether we can talk about Islam without being branded an Islamophobe, whether we can talk about Muslims without being lampooned as a racist. And that's the real issue. And on that, I think what most alleged members of the intellectual dark web have done is opened up that space. What's been lacking is a robust debate on that and allowing for other members of the broader political spectrum to talk about that. The real issue is that Charlie Hebdo cartoons, why couldn't the Charlie Hebdo cartoons be printed and left alone? Why should those cartoon and the cartoonists then be killed? Salman Rushdie, one of the reasons why he's living in New York and not here is because of the security threat that the man faces. Now, that's been going on for about 20-25 years, and I think that's at the core of it, that and I speak as a Westerner and as a Muslim, can we uphold the values that we cherish, from Socrates down to Hume to Locke to Voltaire to Rousseau to where we are now? Yes, be a Burkean or yes, be a Voltairean, but ultimately recognize that the West stands as a pillar with civilizational values, and you compromise one of them, you undermine others. And that's the real risk here.
But I take it it's not a question of can you speak about Islam, but how do you understand what is going on? How do you understand Hebdo? How do you understand the Rushdie affair? I mean, I very rarely hear anybody speak about the importance of the third great revolution of the 20th century after the Russian and the Chinese was the Islamic revolution. And there are very large issues. And the problem with a lot of discussion which is anti-Islam or perceived as such or Islamic phobic is it shrinks it down to, as it were, Islamic people are pre-modern, pre-civilized.
Philip, forgive me, but the fact that you talk about the Islamic revolution, I mean, that's an indication of the fact that we're in a space where we feel that Islam has had a revolution. And the Islamic,
it did in 79 in Iran.
Well, so that's part of the problem, because that form of Islam, which is politicized, confrontational, anti-West, wants to see Israel destroyed, that's on the rise. And I've just published a book called The House of Islam, A Global History, and I break down the various forms of Islam. The biggest conversational problem I have as an ordinary Muslim is that the conversation is dominated by the likes of the Iranian government and then Salafi extremists and Islamists who want to blow themselves up and blow others up. And then there's a reaction to them from commentators in the West. An ordinary Muslim, most of whom are just getting on with their lives, then have to take this heat from two extremes. Now, how do we have a conversation where Muslims come to terms with being modernized, westernized citizens and fully flourishing contributors to the West and not seen as a suspect fifth column? That, by the way, I think is a result of the extremism, the terrorism. And ISIS talked about having a duty to end the grey zone, the coexistence that can exist. So the Islamic revolution, I'm afraid, in Iran is part of the problem.
Let me just say that, like a couple of other people in this loose assortment, the intellectual dark web, like Sam Harris and to a greater extent my friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I suppose the Islam bit was the first time I tripped over this wire, which was that it was the first time I became aware that I would be in a studio with a politician from almost all political parties, and anything that came up on the edge of the debate, which was exactly where the debate needed to be. For instance, on Islamic blasphemy laws. And I would see, and this doesn't work on radio, but I would see their eyes go wide. I would see the perspiration. They just didn't want to talk about this. There become acceptable ways to talk about it. Oh, you talk about the tech companies and their responsibility or something like that. What is it they know? They know that they're standing on the edge of a potential precipice. Now, I happen to think that's one of the most dangerous actual precipices of all at the moment, because it can, for some of us, be a physical one. But I see the same thing happening on other things. I saw it recently in a studio when the trans thing came up. I saw a politician. I just knew what she was thinking. Her eyes went wide. Oh, God, what can we say this week? What are the rules that have changed? And she knows that she comes out with the wrong thing. There'll be some kind of mob about it online. Before you know it, the party leader will ask them to stand down from their position and it's all over. So my point is, it's not always as serious as the death squad that was after Salman Rushdie. But there are forms of the proximity to career and more serious ends is just something which seems to me, as I say, partly because of the age of social media, to be on everybody's minds. And here's the final point. Here's the next bit from that. I've seen that for a long time growing among politicians, where basically politicians can no longer speak honestly in public. But that is now happening at a lower level than the politicians, a tier down, to writers and journalists and others who are ending up performing in the manner of politicians, holding lines, making sure they tread carefully around orthodoxies. And this, just for all of us, seems to me to be a dangerous state of affairs to have got into.
It's a strange thing where you're living in a free society, but people are sort of practicing doublethink.
And that breeds hypocrisy. And I mean, as someone who's Muslim and proud to be Muslim, that's not the kind of life that we're expected to lead. Douglas is absolutely right, by the way, on this, the politicians and the lack of convictions. And I mean, I would go one step below the writers and the thinkers and onto university campuses. And it's part of a much broader problem, and that's of moral relativism, that there's no truth, there's no right, there's no wrong, that everything is equal, and therefore we have no moral clarity in our assessment of what can and can't be said.
Exactly. Part of what we could say is going on is some kind of backlash against precisely what Ed's just described, is particularly young people, young men and young women, just saying, look, we're told absolutely everything is relative. We're told that everyone can be whatever they think they are, and I call BS. And I'm willing to just listen to or let go to or watch YouTube videos of anyone who's willing to call BS to that.
You're listening to me, Philip Dodd, and this is Free Thinking on Radio 3. As it happens, you can hear interviews with other members of the intellectual dark web, such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Steven Pinker, and most recently, Jordan B. Peterson. Listen via the iPlayer Radio or sign up for the BBC Arts and Ideas podcast. Let's, as we come towards the end, let's push it, because you've largely described what you're opposed to. Ed mentions relativism, which we're all opposed to, because it's easy to be opposed to relativism.
No, we're not all.
No,
we're all,
why? Not at all.
No, we're all opposed to it in principle. What I mean is it's intellectually very difficult to get out of it unless one's religious, because if one's religious, one's got God to answer to, which is the reason the Chinese Communist Party is much more worried by Christianity than it is by other kinds of forms. So, but what is it you want? Now, Douglas, it can't simply be you want the BBC to be open to more conversations on it. Maybe you think that's a good thing. It can't simply be that you want politicians to be more open or universities. What is it that you want?
I want a politics where we talk about, first of all, where we're operating in a good faith environment. You know, going back to what Douglas said earlier in the show, you're constructing your arguments too much of the time for sort of, you put it better than I will, but sort of to assuming that they're going to be read in bad faith and to sort of protect yourself. But increasingly it seems to me we're slipping.
No, do you do that? Do you write in bad faith? Because you're telling me other people do it. So do you do it?
No, that's absolutely not.
It's a question because you're saying...
Are you suggesting I'm a troll?
No. What I'm suggesting, you raise the question precisely that in this present culture people have to do double thing. And I'm just wondering if it's the case. So I'm thinking to myself, well, actually, I, Philip Dodd, don't. Maybe I'm stupid. Do you, Bari Weiss? It's a perfectly reasonable question.
Do I act in bad faith?
When you're writing?
No, I don't think that I do. No,
well, then why
I don't think that I do.
Then why would you assume everyone else does, is my question.
I'm not assuming everyone else does.
No, I think
I'm simply suggesting that some people do.
I'm not answering for Barry, but if I can say so, Philip, I think we all know exactly what is going on in these situations. It is, look, if you've got a load of crap you get whenever you write about one thing, when you see something else that is a lie, are you likely to identify it as such, or are you likely to think, I could do without that crap as well? Okay, and now I know journalists all across our country. I know many journalists from the BBC who say things like, I'm not willing to take X on as a subject. I'm just not willing to. I've had this discussion with senior people in the BBC who've admitted to me they don't want to take stuff on because they know what's coming their way if they do. Now, an individual may occasionally be willing to take on one big fight, but there's just a point when you go, you know, I said some years ago, I've already got some Islamist problems going for me. I've already been told not to appear in public by the police for some time. I could do without the transsexuals coming for me as well. I could just do with a break this week, okay? We've all had that instinct. And you know, sometimes it's funny, but a lot of the time it isn't. And it's people ducking questions because the price of speaking honestly has become too high for people to want to pay it.
I met an 18-year-old last night who wants to be a journalist, and he said to me, I love everything you write. I'm sort of a closeted anti-PC kid, very, very liberal kid. And he said, but my mom told me not to write about it because she doesn't want me to become like you. And what he meant by that was, is it worth sort of walking around with this smear on you that's very hard to get off once it's on? And many reasonable people, not cowards, just reasonable people who want to just live a life of sort of without walking around with that label, make the choice to sort of stay out of the game.
And here's one very quick thing which is different now. 10 or 15 years ago, if somebody had said, for instance, Bari Weiss or Jordan Peterson or Christina Hoff Sommers is a horrible bigot and racist and Nazi, that stuck really badly and it could actually end your career. Nowadays, something very interesting is happening because of the internet. People can look into it for themselves. So somebody says, Christina Hoff Sommers is a Nazi, and they think, well, I'm going to go and look. Oh, it turns out she's a liberal feminist with a whole load of normal liberal ideas. So it turns on the accuser. In other words, everyone is finding a way to walk past and survive the first assault.
Once you survive it, and this is why I think the intellectual dark web folks are so interesting, once you survive that smear over whatever issue, or the purge, or whatever happens, you're liberated. You're on the other side of it. And you genuinely are able to sort of think openly and freely. I think there's a lot to be said for sort of coming out, as it were.
Come out by all means, but I think the two things should be taken off the table. One, removal of people from their jobs for their views. People should be allowed to say and think and write where they stand on a whole range of issues. And two, the death threats that have been culminating. And it's not just the extremists who are undertaking the killing, it's those who are silent when it happens, those who don't want to write about it. I mean, there were politicians here in Britain when Salman Rushdie was under death threat that said, well, he had it coming to him, he should have been more careful. So that's more of a problem for me, not just the killers, because we can identify them, but it's the wider silence that, yes, he or she went a bit too far. We should have more moral courage across society and not just leave it to a minority of people to be lampooned or be seen as heretics, because this is about civilization itself. It's not about a group of individuals.
One last question to each, and just brief. What is the one thing you would like to change, Douglas?
In the world?
In relationship to
Could
this
you narrow
debate?
your question down slightly?
In relationship to this debate.
Well, I just wish that people felt able to say what they see before them without thinking through that they have career-ending consequences as a result. And we actually had the discussions we need to have. There are a lot of these issues, by the way, that have come up that we discussed that I am not certain about the end conclusions of. I just know we should be having them.
Ed?
I echo that. We should continue to maintain that old Greek spirit of thinking freely, asking free questions and coming to logical conclusions.
Barry?
Focus on ideas, not on identity.
Bari Weiss in New York, thank you very much. And to Ed Hussein and to Douglas Murray here with me in London. That's all from me and from my producer Craig Smith tonight. Join Matthew Sweet tomorrow as he looks at obsessive love and the eroticism of piano playing. Thanks for listening. You can find more from our archives and further information about the guests and topics discussed by looking up the Free Thinking Programme website on BBC Radio 3. And if we've whetted your appetite for more discussions about arts and ideas, you might be interested in other BBC podcasts from Start the Week, Thinking Aloud, and In Our Time. In Our Time. In Our Time. In Our Time. In Our Time.